Thanks for coming on, guys.
Well, thanks for having us. It's been a while coming, and we certainly appreciate the opportunity to tell our side of the story.
Yeah, your guys' story is super fascinating. For the people out there that don't know, could you please just give me like a brief background, each of you, as to like where you came from and what your background is?
Yeah, Mike.
Well, I joined the Florida Department of Transportation in May of 1980, having just served about 5 years in the Navy. I was an underwater photographer, diver in the Navy, and when I got out, the Florida State Employment Service pointed me to a job in Tampa with bridge inspection, and I went over and interviewed, and Bob hired me, and we went from there.
And yourself, Bob?
Unfortunately, I didn't have any choice in where I was born, but I was born up north in Connecticut, in a small town called Clinton, where I taught myself to dive at about 16. Joined the Marine Corps, did my time in Vietnam, got some military training in diving, ended up working for the Department of Transportation, was hired in January 1974 after several years as a commercial diver after I left the Marine Corps. Back then we were statewide. There was only 8 divers in 1974 that covered the entire state. So we basically divided up into 4 different sections, and we traveled all around statewide and did every bridge that was longer than 20 feet and deeper than 2 foot of water for about 6 or 7 years. And then we were assigned to District 1, which is on west central coast of Florida, covered about 14 counties, fresh and salt water, same routine, provided inspections to ensure the safety of the traveling public for the Department of Transportation, strictly underwater. That's what we were. We were professional commercial divers. So that was the beginning of that, and I got my tutorship under a fellow named Vic Griswold, who was the second DOT diver hired in the state in 1969. The first diver hired was a fellow named Dick Barthel. The bridge inspection program didn't begin until 1969, so I got in kind of in the basement, and Mike did as well. It was pretty interesting back then, so it was a lot of one-on-one training and a lot of water time.
Is it right when you started that there was 2 divers in the entire state of Florida whose job was specifically to inspect these bridges all around Florida? And there's hundreds of bridges in Florida, right?
Absolutely, there are
thousands.
There's
of bridges.
about 12. There's currently ballpark about 12,000 bridges in the state of Florida. Not all are water bridges, but 12,000 bridges, give or take. Probably about 3,000 or 4,000 are water bridges. December 17th, 1968, northbound across the Anclote River, the bridge collapsed.
US 19.
US 19, that's right up there in Tarpon Springs in Pinellas County. One person lost their life. Immediately, the media suspected sinkholes, because we did have sinkhole problems back in Florida back then. There was no DOT bridge inspection program, period, in the state of Florida, above water or underwater. There were very few in 1969. That tragedy brought forward legislation that was passed in 1969 that mandated that all of the bridges in Florida be inspected once every 2 years according to national bridge inspection standards out of Washington. A young fella named Ed Burkett, who is still pretty active at work at Campo Kissinger over in Tampa, was assigned that responsibility of creating and developing and putting together a bridge inspection. The first 2 divers were hired in 1969, and there were only 2 divers that covered the entire state.
Wow.
When that bridge collapsed, it was later determined that it collapsed based on the fact that the piling were constructed out of steel. They corroded to a point that led to failure. They then understood through that legislation that it needed to be corrected to ensure the safety of the traveling public and to let them know that bridges were being maintained and taken care of. When they were hired, the immediate task was to inspect all steel bridges in the entire state, just the two of them. They did it for about 4 years, and they hired 2 other divers named Pete Gaddy, Jack D. And now there were 4 divers. They split the state basically up into 4 sections, north, south, east, and west.
Okay.
And as a team, they all swept around and did as many bridges as they could, starting with the steel, inventorying, inspecting. From scratch, there was nothing. Nobody even had an idea how many steel bridges there were. From there, they eventually completed that task, and then they went around and did all the timber bridges, because there are a lot of old bridges that were created back in the day out of creosote timber piling, especially down south.
Still are.
Quick,
Really?
Oh, yeah.
quick
Still.
and fast.
With concrete roads on top of them?
They overdecked them eventually. Back in the 30s and 40s, when they started building bridges out of timber, they just had planks.
Oh, okay.
They eventually overtopped them with concrete and asphalt, as the applications came along. There's some fantastic pictures of the old Alligator Alley and being created in the 30s and whatnot that show that very well. They found, obviously, that the majority of the problems were going to go ahead and be for some of the older bridges. Many of them have never been inspected. So those divers ended up hiring 4 more divers, which created 8. That's when I came aboard in 1974.
So 8 divers.
8 divers in
the entire
1974.
state.
That's correct. And there was only 2-man teams. That's the way it was set up. Everybody understood and understands now, of course, that the best way and the safest way would be 3-man teams. Sometimes if you're out on the water, the 2-man team, having 1 guy in the water is not always good. Having 2 guys in the water is not always good. Best would have been 3. However, in 1969,
Wait, did you just say the best is to have 3 divers in the water at once?
No, would be I misspoke. Would be to have a 3-man dive crew, so that you could have 1 diver in the water or 2 divers in the water and somebody qualified to watch them in the water, rather than just have 2 divers and have them both in the water with nobody in the boat,
nobody on
or
top,
have 1 guy in the boat watching the other guy's bubbles. It doesn't work that way. The best way would have been, however, in 1969. That's just the way it was. 1969, nobody had any idea that the waters that they were getting into, as you can imagine, they were full of alligators. They were full of unknown hazards like pollution and contamination. Some of the waters back in the 60s and 70s were considered industrial canals and stuff. Fenn Holloway and some of the bridges up in the Panhandle with the paper products. Jacksonville, some of them
fertilizers and pesticides and shit.
The chemical, I don't want to get anybody upset, but it sounded like the chemicals that they used to create paper products, they had a lot of problems with
well, I know
the
now
discharge.
It's a problem, so it had to have been worse back then.
Yeah, with the discharge. Yeah,
Yeah.
the water quality back in the 60s and 70s, it was kind of atrocious.
Yeah.
I can remember diving in the Skyway the first couple of times. It was miserable, and then back in the 90s, when I left, it was significantly better, and we began to see a significant change. But back in the day when we were doing the inspections, the 8-man team, we were based out of Orlando, Oviedo technically, and we traveled all around the state and did our inspections. We eventually were absorbed by the districts, but then again, we were still in West Central Florida, so we had that responsibility of the Skyway. So I had, by the time the Skyway accident had occurred, I had a good 4 or 5 years of firsthand knowledge and experience diving on that structure.
How did you guys meet?
He came for a job interview. As he advertised. You didn't tell him you worked in the paper for a little bit. Did you work at the paper?
I used to be a stringer for the old Clearwater newspaper.
What's a stringer?
Shooting, freelance shooting pictures.
Oh, okay.
Just picking up weekend assignments, things like that.
That's awesome.
Yeah, it was fun.
The application.
Back when we had dark rooms.
Yeah.
Ancient technology.
Yeah.
Mike applied for the job as a diver. Back in 1974, the minimum qualifications for a DOT dive inspector, were 5 years full-time commercial diving with military training or military diving experience. A minimum of 5 years. It was not a recreational activity. It was not a sport activity. It was not a fun. It was commercial. It was work. So in other words, we didn't get to choose. which waters we went into, whether it was cold, whether it was warm, whether it was clear, whether it was dirty, whether it was full of critters or not full of critters.
Critters. Define critters is a widely defined term, I feel like.
You live in Florida, however, I can honestly say, and I think Mike can too, I'm
8-foot critters with big teeth.
So happy that we no longer have to dive out there. You got lionfish.
Oh, yeah.
You got the crocodile population has exploded. The alligators are off the endangered species list. We should have been on the UOT diver should have been on the endangered species list back in the day instead of the alligator. However, that's just the way it worked out.
So you said you needed military diving experience. What did you do? Did you actually dive in the military?
Yes.
What did you do what did you do?
Secret.
Can you just give me like
my military
cliff notes of
specialty
it?
was
You were in Vietnam, right?
Ja, phải. Tôi đi Vietnam một ngàn chiến thăm Samui Bai Samui Tham. Tôi trở lại qua Mỹ một ngàn chiến thăm Samui Tham. Yes, I was in Vietnam in 1967 and 1968.
Sorry, we're out of that.
And I returned in 1968. Yes, I was in Vietnam. I had combat experience.
Really? You were combat?
Yes.
And so did you do a lot of stuff? Like, obviously, I don't know much about that, but did you do a lot of underwater stuff?
With my diving experience, I had the ability to blow up anything that they wanted blown up, whether it was above water or underwater. My military specialty was a 1372, which is a nuclear weapons technician. So I was a 19-year-old Marine with a key to the nuclear weapons locker.
Holy shit, that's pretty crazy.
But it's secret. We can't tell anybody that. Yeah, no, I was.
That's intense.
1372.
That's intense. So you were more than qualified to be a DOT diver inspecting these bridges.
I met the qualifications,
Yeah.
and like I said, we had one-on-one for 5 years. That was a minimum before you got your certification.